Hatumtaki Idi Amin mama.
Something is shifting in Africa. In just the past few days, the streets of West Africa have erupted once again. Cameroon, Senegal, two nations, both watching leaders cling to power long after their time should have ended. Elections that were supposed to give hope now feel like déjà vu. The people voted, but their voices were drowned out. So much for democracy, but here's the twist. This wave of manipulation isn't confined to the West. It's spreading. Across the continent, in East Africa, another storm is rising. In Tanzania, the nation once celebrated for stability, something darker is unfolding. And at the center of it all is Samia Suluhu Hassan, the country's first female president, once hailed as a symbol of progress and integrity. Today, her name appears in headlines for a very different reason. Reports say her government has shut down internet services, silencing protesters who dared to speak out. A country that once inspired hope is now echoing with the same cries of frustration we've heard from Dakar to Yaoundé. So how did it come to this? How did a woman once seen as a fresh start, a beacon of leadership, turn into what many now call just another power-hungry ruler? And what does her story reveal about Africa's deeper struggle, the cycle of power, fear, and resistance that keeps repeating itself? Let's find out. October 29, 2025, Tanzania was supposed to make history that day. 37 million people were registered to vote, a nation ready to decide its future. But when dawn broke over Dar es Salaam, something felt off. The streets were quiet. Polling stations stood half empty. The lines that usually stretch around city blocks were missing. Across the capital, officers stood guard, scanning the few who dared to show up. The government tried to calm the fear. A police spokesperson even took to social media urging, people should come out and vote. There's no threat to your safety, but the people didn't believe it. They'd seen the warnings. They'd seen the arrests. They'd seen what happens when you challenge power. So they stayed home, not out of apathy, but out of fear. And that silence at the ballot box spoke louder than any vote ever could. Election day. What was meant to be a peaceful expression of democracy turned into chaos. As polls opened, violent protests broke out across Tanzania. Stones clashed with shields. Tear gas filled the air. The government responded the only way it knew how, by deploying the military. The protesters weren't just angry, they were desperate. Most of them were critics of President Samia Suluhu Hassan and her ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, the political giant that has held onto power since Tanzania's independence in 1961. For decades, that party has ruled not by choice of the people, but by control. And for many Tanzanians, this election was the final straw. To understand the outrage, we have to go back to 2021, the moment the world first met Samia Suluhu Hassan. At 65, she wasn't elected, she ascended. After the sudden death of President John Magufuli, Samia, then vice president, automatically took the top job. In that instant, Tanzania made history. She became the nation's first female president and one of only two women leading a country in Africa, the other, Namibia's Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah. Born in Zanzibar, she had spent years climbing through the ranks, once serving as Minister of Trade, known for her calm demeanor and soft-spoken leadership. And when she took office, she brought something the country hadn't felt in years: hope. Samia promised change. She reversed many of Magufuli's most controversial policies. She reached out to the opposition. She lifted a 6-year ban on political rallies. She even allowed Tundu Lissu, the exiled opposition leader, to return home after years in fear. For a moment, it felt like Tanzania was breathing again. Headlines around the world called her the reformer, the peacemaker, the woman who restored democracy. But that was before the mask slipped. But that's not the only thing she did. Under Hassan, Tanzania joined the international COVAX facility, directed by institutions like the World Health Organization, to help distribute vaccines to developing countries, especially in Africa. She focused on completing large-scale Magufuli-era development projects and launched new ones, especially around railway infrastructure and rural electrification. The president's supporters, therefore, praise her record in infrastructure development, improving access to education and improving overall stability of governance in the country. The citizens of Tanzania cannot deny that she has done all this. However, while many hoped Tanzania would become more democratic under her leadership, Hassan's style of governance has become increasingly authoritarian, analysts say, and now more closely resembles that of her predecessor. For example, ahead of the election, a recent report revealed that Hassan's government intensified repressive practices and targeted opposition leaders, civil society activists and groups, journalists and other dissenting voices with forced disappearances, arrests, harassment, and even torture. Interestingly, her government has denied all accusations of human rights violations. But they cannot deny that the key opposition Tundu Lissu of the largest opposition party, Chadema, and Luhaga Mpina of ACT Wazalendo were both barred from contesting in the election. In a trial which is still ongoing, Tundu Lissu was charged with treason and might face the death penalty. He was charged for treason in April after giving a speech which prosecutors said called on the public to rebel and disrupt presidential and legislative elections scheduled for October. Not only was he arrested, his party Chadema was disqualified from contesting in the election after demanding changes to an electoral process that it said favors the ruling party. Beside Lissu, local media reported that 2 Chadema party members attending a rally in support of Lissu on April 24th were also arrested by the Tanzanian police. The deputy chairperson of the party, John Heche, was also detained in May, but he was later released. As for Luhaga Mpina, he was barred from contesting in the elections in August for nominations during the presidential primaries. So when Tanzanians, or at least the few who dared, went to the polls on October 29th, they already knew the outcome. It wasn't really an election, it was a performance. On paper, 17 candidates were running for president. But in reality, there was only one name that mattered: Samia Suluhu Hassan. The rest belonged to minor parties, small voices with no real power, no national structure, and no chance of winning. The path to victory was clear. The system was built to deliver it. Just days before the vote, several opposition parties called for a boycott. They told citizens to stay home, to protest a process that was never meant to be fair. But the president had other plans. Standing firm before the cameras, she issued a warning. The only demonstrations that will exist are those of people going to the polling stations to vote. There will be no other demonstrations. There will be no security threat. Her message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated, and her police backed her up. They warned against posting or sharing inciting content online, threatening arrests for anyone who dared to question the system. In a country once seen as a beacon of peace, fear now ruled the digital space. The streets were quiet, the ballots were predictable, and the democracy Tanzanians had once believed in was starting to look like an illusion. Despite the threats, despite the warnings, Tanzanians refused to stay silent. On election day, while ballots waited untouched in empty polling stations, hundreds flooded the streets of Dar es Salaam. They weren't there to vote, they were there to be heard. Chanting for electoral reform and true democracy, their message cut through the tear gas and chaos. We are tired. We want an independent electoral commission, so every Tanzanian can choose the leader they want. Their voices carried far beyond the capital. Protests broke out in Mbeya, in the southwest, and across the border town of Tunduma. Everywhere, the same cry: freedom, fairness, and a chance to decide their own future. But the day didn't stay peaceful for long. Anger boiled over, fires were lit, vehicles burned, public buildings were smashed. By nightfall, the streets looked more like a war zone than a democracy. And as the flames rose over Dar es Salaam, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about an election. It was about a people reaching their breaking point. And then, chaos exploded. In response to the growing unrest, police fired tear gas into the crowds. But the people didn't run. They fought back. Hundreds of protesters hurled stones and debris, forcing the officers to retreat. Through the thick smoke, their voices echoed: "We want our country back." The battle for democracy had spilled onto the streets of Dar es Salaam. But it didn't end there. As flames rose over the Kimara and Ubungo neighborhoods, Inspector General of Police Camillus Wambura declared a curfew starting at 6 p.m. The order came after demonstrators torched a bus and set a gas station ablaze. Local media painted an even darker picture. Unrest was spreading. Magomeni, Kinondoni, Tandale. Each name became another flashpoint. Far from the capital, polling stations were vandalized in Dodoma, Arusha, and Mbeya. What began as a call for reform had turned into a full-blown uprising. And for the first time in years, Tanzania, once known for peace, stood on the edge of something dangerous. As the chaos raged in the streets, another silence fell, this time online. Across Tanzania, internet connectivity collapsed. Messages stopped sending. Videos stopped loading. Voices were cut off mid-sentence. Global Internet Monitor NetBlocks described it as a nationwide digital blackout. A country once connected to the world was suddenly in the dark. At the same time, the opposition party Chadema spoke out, defiant, furious, and unafraid. They called the election a coronation, not a democratic vote. Their Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Deogratias Munishi, told Kenya's Citizen Television, "This process lacks genuine competition." To them, the outcome was decided long before a single ballot was cast. But the government denied everything. Officials insisted the election was free, fair, and transparent, that there were no human rights violations, no abductions, no intimidation. Outside, the streets burned. Inside, the networks were silent. And somewhere in between, truth became just another casualty. Now, while the results of the election are expected in 3 days' time, anyone with eyes can clearly see that President Samia would most likely win the election. But the question is this what democracy is about? Her actions are reminiscent of those taken by her male counterparts in the recently concluded elections both in Cameroon and Ivory Coast. Just like how Samia barred the two major opposition candidates from contesting in the elections, the incumbent president of Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, who has been declared winner of the election, also barred the two major opposition candidates from contesting in the elections. While Tanzania burned, another familiar story unfolded, this time in Cameroon. There, the outcome was never in doubt. President Paul Biya didn't need to win hearts. He already owned the system. The National Electoral Commission was firmly in his hands. When the institution that counts the votes can be bought, the will of the people becomes nothing more than decoration. So once again, a leader who should have stepped down, didn't. And once again, Africa was told this was democracy. But here's the real question. Is this what democracy has become? A theater where ballots are cast, but power never changes hands? Even more disturbing is the silence. The African Union, the continent's highest body, has said nothing, not a word, despite clear violations of the very democratic principles it was built to protect. And that silence speaks volumes. Because we remember how quickly the Union condemned and suspended Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso for daring to replace failed civilian governments with military ones. They called it the greatest sin against democracy. But now, as civilian rulers manipulate elections and crush dissent, the same union watches quietly, as if the problem is not tyranny, but who wears the uniform. So tell me, what's the real difference between a soldier seizing power with a gun and a politician stealing it with a ballot? Democracy is supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So this means it's the citizens who should choose who leads them, right? But that's not what we see in Africa generally. In Africa, the leaders intimidate and bribe to get voters to vote in their favor, or they even threaten to punish those who vote for the opposite party. They bribe or threaten the leaders of the body responsible for carrying out the election so that they can work it in their favor. Some of them even deliberately send thugs to election centers to disrupt the election process. The fact is, most of the leaders who end up as leaders of African nations were not chosen by the African people. They were imposed on them. The elections are never free and fair. The exact playbook happening in Tanzania, Cameroon, and Ivory Coast. In Africa, democracy has been such that once a presidential candidate wins an election, he becomes all-powerful. They can remove and appoint anyone they like, even if the person is not competent for the job. It's one of the reasons why development has stalled in the continent. In addition, democracy has allowed an elected leader to use power and the state machinery to advance the economic interests of his ethnic group and exclude all others. This is the reason why virtually all civil wars in Africa started. A perfect example of this is Cameroon and how the English-speaking Cameroonians have been marginalized for so long. So we ask again, how is this better than military rule? In our opinion, it's worse because it gives an illusion that the people have power when in truth they do not. Now, we are not the only ones who think this. Political activist and the former Deputy National Publicity Secretary of the All Progressives Congress in Nigeria, Timi Frank, said the recent elections held in Tanzania, Cameroon, and Ivory Coast are sham exercises and a disgrace to the African continent. Frank, in a statement on Thursday, said what took place in the three countries were not elections, but selections marred by manipulation, intimidation, and political terrorism. He lamented that rather than allowing the will of the people to prevail, incumbent leaders in Africa have continued to impose themselves through fraudulent means. These elections are a disgrace and shame to Africa. In this 21st century, the continent should be making democratic progress. But what we see instead is the growing culture of rigging, violence, and oppression, Frank said. He urged the international community, including the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union, not to recognize or congratulate the outcomes of such fraudulent elections. According to him, the global community must take decisive steps to rescue democracy in Africa before the continent slides into chaos. If nothing is done, this systematic rigging may soon lead to widespread civil unrest and more coups across the continent. The US and EU should impose targeted sanctions on these leaders and their cronies who have destroyed the democratic process in their countries, he stated. Well, the truth is that the US, the EU, and the international community cannot help Africa to restore democracy. Sanctioning these leaders won't do anything. If Africa truly wants to be democratic, the job lies in the hands of Africans, beginning with the leaders themselves, who ought to be accountable to the people. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.